For 30 years, diplomats and policymakers have called for decisive action on climate change. And for something like 30 years, the climate change has just grown worse. There's a bunch of reasons for this failure. The benefits of climate change lie mostly in the future. They're diffuse and really hard to pin down, and they're going to all accrue above all to poor populations that don't have much of a voice in politics, whether those in countries that emit most of the world's warming pollution or at the global level. The cost of climate action, on the other hand, are evident here and now, and they fall on well-organized interest groups with real political power. In a multipolar world without a responsible hegemon, any collective effort is really hard to organize, and the profound uncertainty about what lies ahead makes it really hard to move decisively. These political hurdles are formidable. The good news is that technological progress can make it much easier to clear them by driving down the cost of action. In the decades to come, innovation could make severe cuts in emissions, also known as deep decarbonization, and that could be available at reasonable cost. That could mean reshaping about 10 sectors in the global economy, including electric power, transportation, and other parts of agriculture, by simply reinforcing positive change where it's already happening and investing heavily where it isn't. In a few sectors, like electric power, a major transformation is already underway, and low-emission technologies are quickly becoming more widespread, at least in China, India, and most Western countries. The right policy interventions in wind, solar, and nuclear power, among other technologies, could soon make countries' power grids far less dependent on conventional fossil fuels and radically reduce emissions in the process. Technological process and progress in clean electricity has set off a really good virtuous circle, with each new innovation creating more political will to do so and to do even more. Replicating this symbiosis of technology and politics in other sectors is essential. In most high emission industries, however, deep decarbonization has been much slower to arrive. In sectors like transportation, steel, cement, and plastics, companies are really going to continue to resist profound change unless they're convinced that decarbonization represents not only costs and risks for investors, but also an opportunity to increase value and revenue. Only a handful of companies have grasped the need for action, and only a few have begun to test zero-emission technologies that are at the right scale. Unless governments and businesses come together now to change that, that's simply with bold-sounding international agreements and marginal tweaks with things like mild carbon taxes, but they also need a strong, comprehensive industrial policy. Well, there's going to be little hope of reaching net zero emissions before it's too late. From today's vantage point, no single domain offers greater opportunities for deep carbonization than electric power. The use of electricity does not increase or reduce emissions in itself. Electricity delivers energy that may or may not be clean, depending upon how it was generated. An electric car, for example, doesn't do much good against global warming if all the electricity comes from conventional coal power plants. Still, electrifying the economy, in other words, designing more processes to run on electricity than the direct combustion of fuels, that part is essential. This is because, compared with trying to reduce emissions in millions of places where they might occur, it's a heck of a lot more easier and more efficient to reduce emissions at a modest number of power plants before distributing the clean energy by wire. Today, Western economies convert like 30% of their energy into electric power. If they want to get serious about decarbonization, that fraction is going to have to double or more. Getting there is going to require progress on two fronts. The first is the electrification of tasks that use vast amounts of energy but still rely on fossil fuels, like transportation and heating. Overall, transportation accounts for 27% of global energy use, and nearly all of it relies on oil. The car industry has had some success in changing this. The latest electric vehicles rival high-end conventional cars in their performance and cost. And electric cars now make up about 8% of new sales in California, although nationwide in America it's only like 1.3%. And nearly 56% of new vehicles are electric in Norway, where the government offers huge subsidies to buyers. With improved batteries, heavier duty vehicles like buses and trucks could soon follow. In fact, China already fields a vehicle fleet of over 420,000 electric buses. By contrast, aviation, which makes up only 2% of global emissions, but is growing rapidly and creates condensation trails in the sky that doubles the warming effect, well, that is a much tougher challenge. A modern battery can store only 2% of the energy contained in a comparable weight of jet fuel, meaning that any electric airplane would need to carry an extremely large load in batteries to travel any reasonable distance. Even in the best case scenario, commercial electric aviation at significant scale is decades away, at least for long-haul flights. Long-distance shipping also faces challenges so hard that electrification is unlikely to be the best route. And in each of these areas, electrification is all but the most difficult because it requires not only changing the conveyances, but also building entirely new charging infrastructures. Besides transportation, the most important electrification frontier is heating, not just in buildings, but as part of industrial production too. All told, heating consumes about half the raw energy that people and firms around the world use. Of that fraction, some 50% goes into industrial processes that require very high temperatures, like the production of cement, steel, and the refining of oil, including plastic. These sectors are going to continue to rely on on-site fossil fuel combustion for the foreseeable future, since electricity really cannot match the temperature and flexibility of direct fuel combustion. But in other areas, like low-temperature industrial processes and space heating for buildings, electrification is a heck of a lot more practical. Heat pumps are a case in point. Whereas conventional heaters work by heating up indoor air, heat pumps act like reversible air conditioners. They move heat or necessary cold air indoors or outdoors. It's a far more efficient approach. Electrification, of course, will not on its own reduce emissions by a whole lot, unless the power grid that generates and distributes the electricity gets cleaner too. Ironically, some countries have made modest progress on this front, even as they have doubled down on fossil fuels. China, for example, has swapped out aging coal power plants with newer, more efficient ones, cutting emission rates in the process. The country's most efficient coal power plants now emit less carbon dioxide per unit of electricity than comparable United States coal power plants. The United States, for its part, has cut down on its emissions thanks to innovations on horizontal drilling and fracking that have made it economically viable to extract shale gas. In 2005, when this technology first became commercially relevant, coal accounted for about half the electricity produced in the United States. Now today, coal's share is down to 1/4, with much cleaner and inexpensive natural gas and renewables making up the difference. In theory, fossil fuels could still become much cleaner, even nearly emission-free. This could be possible with the help of so-called carbon capture and storage, or CCS technologies, which capture the carbon dioxide emissions created by the industrial processes and pump it safely underground. In practice, investors remain wary of this approach, but in both the United States and some European countries, recently introduced subsidies are expected to unleash a wave of new carbon capture sequestration projects in the years ahead. One carbon capture and sequestration scheme currently being tested by a group of engineering and energy firms completely rethinks the design of power plants, efficiently generating electricity from natural gas while capturing nearly all the carbon dioxide produced in the process at little extra cost. In regions where natural gas is cheap and abundant, this technology could be a game changer. For now, improving fossil fuel technology has amounted to shallow decarbonization. It has reduced the emissions enough to slow the rate of carbon change and climate change in the United States. Emissions from the power sector have dropped by 29% since 2005, thanks mainly to the shale gas revolution and growth of renewables. But it's not enough to stop it. To prevent the world from warming further is going to require a bigger focus on technologies that have essentially zero emissions, like wind, solar, hydroelectric, and nuclear power, in addition to carbon capture and sequestration, even if that proves to be commercially scalable. According to the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, these low-carbon technologies would need to generate 80% of the world's electricity by 2050, up from about 1/3 today, in order to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Renewables, in particular, are going to play a central role. Thanks to decreases in the cost of wind and solar power equipment, and thanks to mature hydroelectric power industry, renewable energy already accounts for over 1/4 of global electricity production. Nuclear provides about another 10%. In the United States, the cost of electricity from large solar farms has tumbled by 90% since 2009, and wind energy prices have fallen by nearly 70%, and both continue to drop. Given these plunging costs, the main challenge is no longer to make renewables cheap. Rather, we've got to integrate them into the power grid without any disruptions. To avoid blackouts, a power grid must align supply and demand all the time. Energy output from wind and solar plants, however, vary with the weather, the sun, and the daily rise of the sun, and the season. The more power grid relies on renewables then, the more often the supply is not going to match the demand. In the extreme, extra power has to be dumped, meaning that valuable capital and land get used inefficiently. To be less vulnerable to such shocks, utility companies have to expand the size of their power grids so that each draws on a larger and more diverse array of energy sources. In order to deal with the excess supply from renewables, and that's a condition that's going to become much more frequent as the share of renewables rises, they must also create incentives for users to vary their demand for power more actively and find ways to store surplus electricity on a much larger scale. Today, nearly all bulk storage capacity takes the form of, hydroelectric pumps. They store energy by moving water uphill and recovering about 80% of the power when it flows back down. In the years ahead, soaring demand for electric vehicles will drive down the cost of lithium-ion batteries. These batteries could become an affordable way to store energy at the grid level too. And as the need for storage increases, even cheaper methods may come to the market. To better integrate renewables, our policymakers also have to rely on the strategic use of another zero-emission technology. That's nuclear energy. Although most efficient when running flat out, something like 24 hours a day, nuclear power plants can also operate flexibly to cover the supply gaps from wind and solar power. Some of France's nuclear reactors, for instance, already cycle from about 1/4 to full power and back again, sometimes twice a day, to compensate for fluctuations in the supply and demand of renewables. Independent of renewables, nuclear power already contributes massively to cleaner grids. Every year, some 440 operational nuclear reactors account for lower global carbon dioxide emissions of an estimated 1.2 billion metric tons. In the United States, research suggests that keeping most existing nuclear plants open is going to be far less expensive than many other policy options. In fact, most countries would do well to expand the nuclear power even further to cut back on their emissions. In the West, however, major expansions are not on the horizon. Public opposition is really strong, and the cost of building new reactors is high, in part because countries have built far too few reactors to benefit from the savings that come with repetition and standardization. Yet other parts of the world, especially China and South Korea, which have more active nuclear power programs, the costs are much lower, and public opposition is less pronounced. Moreover, whereas these countries once designed and built their own reactors, today many simply import them. That model can create a lot of new risks. Something the sector's leading exporter today is like Russia. And that's a country not renowned for its diligence regarding reactor safety or the security of nuclear materials. But it also has the potential to make commercial nuclear technology available to many countries that could not develop and deploy it safely on their own. Abu Dhabi's purchase of 4 gigantic South Korean-built reactors, the first of which is set to start operating next year, shows the promise of this model. The same approach could work for other countries that currently satisfy their large energy needs with fossil fuels, like Saudi Arabia. When it comes to the precise technological makeup of a future decarbonized economy, expert opinions start to diverge. Engineers and economists, for the most part, imagine solutions that bundle several approaches, with both carbon capture, sequestration, and nuclear power acting as important complements to renewables. Political scientists, on the other hand, tend to see a bigger role for renewables, one of the few areas in energy policy that usually garner support from across the ideological spectrum, including in the United States. Yet even this rather popular solution can prove divisive. Fierce debates rage over exactly where to locate generators like wind turbines, including among putative environmentalists who support the technology only if they don't have to look at it. Public opposition to new wind turbines in Norway, even in already industrialized areas, and to offshore wind parks in the eastern United States, are harbingers of tough siting fights to come. The same issue arises when it comes to power lines. Making the most of renewables requires longer, more numerous power lines that can move renewable power wherever it will be needed. But public opposition can make such grid expansions a bureaucratic nightmare. In California, for example, the most recent big power line designed to move renewable power where it will be useful, in this case, from the sunny desert to San Diego, took a decade to build, even though the technical engineering and construction portion of the project should have consumed no more than 2 years. China, by contrast, has blown past the efforts of the United States and Europe, with dozens of ultra-high voltage lines, most of them built in the last decade, crisscrossing the country. Political obstacles notwithstanding, expanding electrification of transportation and heat and the production of low-carbon electricity offers the surest path to a clean economy to date. The latest analysis by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for instance, suggests that more pervasive use of clean energy in the global economy is going to cover more than half the cuts that are needed for deep decarbonization. Yet just how big a role electrification will ultimately play is hard to predict, in part because its impact will depend on the future trajectory of rival solutions that are only just beginning to emerge and whose potential is impossible to assess precisely. Hydrogen, in particular, could serve much the same function as electricity does now in carrying energy from producers to users, and it offers crucial advantages. It's a heck of a lot easier to store, making it ideal for power systems that are dependent on ever-fluctuating supplies of renewable energy. And you can burn hydrogen without producing any new emissions to generate the high levels of heat that are needed in heavy industry, meaning they could replace on-site fuel combustion in sectors that are hard to electrify. Hydrogen, either in its pure form or mixed with other chemicals, could also serve as a liquid fuel to power cars, trucks, ships, and airplanes. A zero-emission economy could integrate the two carriers, electricity and hydrogen, using each depending on the suitability for different sectors. The technology needed to turn hydrogen into an energy carrier already exists in principle. One option we have is to break up or electrolyze water into its constituent elements, hydrogen and oxygen. The hydrogen could then be stored or transported through the natural gas pipeline networks that are already strung across all advanced economies. Once it reaches its user, it'd be burned for heat or used as an input for a variety of chemical processes. So far, this approach is way too expensive to be viable on a large scale, but a growing investment, especially in Europe, is posed to drive down the cost rapidly. Initial tests, including planned networks of hydrogen pipelines outside Stockholm for making steel, or in Port Arthur in Texas for industrial chemistry, or in the British city of Leeds for residential heat, and in Teesside area for several applications including power generation, and numerous other ventures will soon yield more insights into how a real-world hydrogen economy is going to fare. Carbon capture sequestration is something of a wild card too. Some industrial processes produce prodigious and highly concentrated streams of carbon dioxide emissions that should be really pretty easy to isolate and capture. The production of cement, which accounts for a whopping 4% of global carbon dioxide emissions, is a pretty good example. But firms operating in global commodity markets, where missteps can be economically disastrous, are hesitant to invest in fledgling systems like carbon capture and sequestration. To change that, state-sponsored real-world testing is way overdue. A beginning Norwegian project to collect natural carbon dioxide from various industrial sources in several northern European countries and to inject that gas underground might give us some answers. Another promising area for reducing emissions is agriculture, a field in which advances on the horizon could yield large cuts. More precise control over the diets of animals raised for food, which are probably going to require more industrial farming and less free grazing, could lead cows, sheep, and other livestock to emit less methane. That's a warming gas that pound for pound is 34 to 86 times as bad as carbon dioxide. It's also going to help if you and I eat less meat. Meanwhile, a whole bunch of different changes in crop cultivation, like altering when rice fields are flooded to strategically determine which engineered crop should be used, could also lower emissions. Agriculture's biggest potential contribution, however, lies below ground. Plants that engage in photosynthesis use carbon dioxide from the air to grow. The mass cultivation of crops that are specially bred to grow larger roots, concept being tested on the small scale right now, along with farming methods that avoid tilling the soil, could store massive amounts of carbon dioxide as underground biomass for several decades or longer. As the hard reality of climate change has set in, some have begun to dream of technologies that could reverse past emissions, like direct air capture machines, which pull carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it underground. Pilot projects suggest that these options are very costly, in part because it is thermodynamically difficult to take a dilute gas from the underground and keep it there. We will see what happens in the future, but the outlook is actually getting very good as long as we take action.